Winter does something to the world that no other season can. It strips away the comfort of daylight. It silences the sounds we rely on to feel connected. And it locks us away behind closed doors and frosted windows, where we're left alone with our thoughts. There's a reason so many people feel uneasy during the winter months. The darkness lasts longer. The cold becomes a physical barrier between us and the outside world. And in that isolation, our senses become sharper. We notice things we might otherwise ignore. Researchers have studied how winter affects the human mind. The lack of sunlight disrupts our circadian rhythms. Seasonal changes can increase anxiety and heighten our awareness of threats. When we're cold, tired, and cut off from others, our brains enter a state of hypervigilance. We become more alert to danger, real or imagined. But tonight, the stories I'm sharing aren't imagined. They're real accounts from people who experienced something truly disturbing during the coldest nights of winter. These aren't ghost stories or legends. They're events that actually happened, told by people who lived through them. Let's begin. Our first story comes from a man named Thomas, who lived in rural Montana. His house sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by open fields and scattered pine trees. The nearest town was 12 miles away. Thomas had lived there for 3 years and enjoyed the solitude. He worked remotely as a software developer, so he rarely needed to leave his property. He kept supplies stocked, maintained a generator for power outages, and felt prepared for whatever winter might bring. In mid-January, a severe winter storm was forecasted. The Weather Service warned of heavy snowfall, high winds, and dangerous wind chills. Thomas made sure he had everything he needed: food, water, firewood, fuel for the generator. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening. Snow began falling heavily, and by midnight, Thomas could barely see past his porch. The wind howled, rattling his windows. He settled in for the night, expecting to be stuck inside for a few days. By Wednesday morning, the storm hadn't let up. Thomas woke to find nearly 3 feet of snow had accumulated overnight. His driveway was completely buried. The road was impassable. But he wasn't worried. He'd been through storms before. What concerned him was the sound he heard that afternoon. He was working in his office when he heard it, a loud, metallic banging coming from somewhere outside. It sounded like someone hitting a metal pole or a piece of equipment. The noise would come in short bursts, then stop, then start again. Thomas went to the window but couldn't see anything through the blowing snow. The sound continued intermittently for the next hour. Then silence. Then again. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was something loose on his property being blown by the wind, a gate or a piece of siding. But the rhythm seemed too deliberate, too regular. That night the banging stopped. Thomas tried to sleep but found himself listening for it, straining to hear over the wind. Around 2 in the morning he heard something else. Footsteps on his roof. They were slow and heavy, moving from one end of the house to the other. Thomas sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The footsteps stopped directly above his bedroom. Then he heard scraping like someone dragging something across the shingles. Thomas grabbed his phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell tower. His landline was dead too. He was completely cut off. The sounds on the roof continued for nearly 20 minutes. Footsteps, scraping, then silence. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat in his living room with a flashlight and a baseball bat, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, he bundled up and went outside to investigate. The snow was still falling but lighter now. Thomas walked around his house, looking up at the roof. And that's when he saw them, fresh tracks in the snow on his roof. Human-sized boot prints, leading from the back of his house to the front, then down the side where a tall pine tree grew close to the building. Someone had climbed onto his roof during the storm. Someone had walked around up there, above his head, while he slept. Thomas followed the tracks in the snow on the ground. They led from the tree across his yard and out toward the road. But then they stopped. Just ended in the middle of his property, as if the person had simply vanished. He went back inside and locked every door and window. He stayed awake for the next 2 days until the storm finally passed and the roads were cleared. When the sheriff finally made it out to his property, they investigated but found no other evidence. The tracks had been partially covered by new snow. They couldn't determine who had been there or why. The sheriff suggested it might have been someone seeking shelter from the storm, someone who'd gotten disoriented and climbed on the roof by mistake. But that didn't explain why they hadn't knocked on the door, why they hadn't called out for help. Thomas moved 6 months later. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been on his roof that night had been watching him, studying him, waiting for something. He still doesn't know who it was or what they wanted. Isolation amplifies fear because it removes our safety nets. When we're alone, there's no one to validate our perceptions or share our burden of vigilance. Our brains evolved to find safety in numbers, and when we're cut off from others, especially during extreme conditions like a winter storm, every unexplained sound becomes a potential threat. Thomas's experience shows how vulnerability and uncertainty can transform a safe space into something terrifying. Our second story takes place in Denver, Colorado. It was shared by a young woman named Rachel, who worked as a nurse at a hospital on the outskirts of the city. Rachel often worked the evening shift, which meant she'd leave the hospital around 11 at night. The hospital had a large parking structure for levels, usually half empty by the time her shift ended. It was early February, and Denver was experiencing one of its coldest winters in decades. Temperatures regularly dropped below zero. The parking structure wasn't heated, and by the time Rachel finished work each night, it felt like walking into a freezer. One Thursday evening, Rachel left work exhausted. It had been a difficult shift, and all she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep. She took the elevator up to the third level where she'd parked that morning. The parking structure was nearly empty. Only a handful of cars remained. Rachel's car was parked in the far corner, near the exterior wall where there was an opening to the outside. Wind whistled through the structure, carrying with it small flurries of snow. As Rachel walked toward her car, she heard an engine start. She looked around and saw a dark sedan, parked about 30 feet away, its headlights off. The engine was running, exhaust visible in the cold air. But no one got out of the car. It just sat there idling. Rachel felt a small prick of unease but pushed it aside. Someone was probably warming up their car just like she was about to do. She reached her vehicle, unlocked it, and got inside quickly, locking the doors behind her. She started her engine and began backing out of her space. As she did, she noticed in her rearview mirror that the dark sedan was also backing out. That's odd, Rachel thought. But she continued driving toward the exit ramp. The sedan followed. Rachel drove down to the second level. The sedan stayed behind her, maintaining a consistent distance. Now Rachel's unease grew stronger. She told herself it was probably nothing. They were both leaving at the same time. It was just a coincidence. But when she reached the first level and began heading toward the exit, the sedan accelerated, closing the distance between them. Rachel's heart rate spiked. She drove faster, eager to get out of the parking structure and onto the main road where there would be other cars, other people. The sedan matched her speed. As Rachel approached the exit gate, she had to stop to scan her parking pass. The barrier lifted and she drove through quickly. In her mirror, she saw the sedan pull up to the gate behind her. But the sedan didn't have a pass. The barrier didn't lift. Rachel thought she was safe now. She'd be able to drive away while the sedan was stuck at the gate. Then the sedan reversed, accelerated, and crashed through the wooden barrier. Rachel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was deliberately following her. She pulled out onto the main road and turned right, heading toward a busier part of town. The sedan followed, staying close. Rachel ran a yellow light at an intersection. The sedan ran the red light that followed. Rachel's mind raced. She couldn't go home. She couldn't lead this person to her apartment. She thought about calling the police, but her phone was in her bag on the passenger seat, and she was too afraid to take her eyes off the road. Up ahead, she saw a gas station brightly lit with several cars at the pumps. She made a quick decision and swerved into the parking lot, pulling up directly in front of the glass windows where the cashier would be able to see her. The sedan pulled in behind her but stopped at the edge of the lot. Rachel grabbed her phone and called 911. She explained what was happening, gave her location, and waited. The dispatcher told her to stay in her locked car and keep the line open. For 5 minutes, the sedan didn't move. It just sat there, engine running, headlights now on, pointing directly at Rachel's car. She couldn't see who was inside. The windshield was tinted and the lights were too bright. Then she heard sirens. A police cruiser pulled into the gas station, lights flashing. The moment the police arrived, the sedan reversed, turned, and sped out of the parking lot, heading in the opposite direction. The police gave chase, but the sedan ran several red lights and eventually disappeared into a residential neighborhood. The officers came back and took Rachel's statement. They told her this wasn't the first report they'd received of someone being followed from that hospital parking structure. Over the past month, 3 other people, all women, had reported similar incidents. All the reports described a dark sedan with tinted windows. The police increased patrols around the hospital and the parking structure. Security cameras were reviewed, but the sedan's license plate had been obscured with mud. They never identified the driver. Rachel requested a transfer to the day shift. She never parked in that structure again. And she never found out who was following her that night, or what they intended to do. Being stalked triggers one of our deepest evolutionary fears: the fear of being prey. When someone follows us, especially in a vulnerable setting like an empty parking structure in the middle of winter, our nervous system responds with acute stress. The cold intensifies this fear because it limits our options for escape and makes us more physically vulnerable. Rachel's instinct to seek safety in a public place likely prevented something far worse from happening. Sometimes our fear is the thing that saves us. Our final story comes from a man named James, who lived with his wife and 2 young children in a house in upstate New York. They'd lived there for 8 years. It was a comfortable home in a safe neighborhood. They knew their surroundings well. The house had a basement that James used as a workshop and storage area. It was partially finished, with concrete floors and exposed beams. James went down there regularly to work on projects or retrieve stored items. In late December, during one of the coldest weeks of the year, James started noticing something strange. The basement felt different. It's hard to explain exactly what he meant by that. He told me the temperature felt wrong, even though he checked the thermostat and it read the same as always. The air felt heavier somehow. And there was a smell he couldn't quite identify, faint but unpleasant. He mentioned it to his wife, Karen, but she hadn't noticed anything unusual. Still, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, one evening, James went down to the basement to get a box of Christmas decorations they'd forgotten to bring up earlier. It was around 8 o'clock. The kids were asleep upstairs. Karen was watching television in the living room. James turned on the basement light and descended the stairs. As he reached the bottom step, he froze. There was someone else in the basement. A man was standing in the far corner, partially hidden behind the furnace. He was filthy, wearing torn clothing and staring directly at James. For a moment, neither of them moved. James's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This was his basement, his home. How was there a stranger standing 15 feet away from him? The man didn't say anything. He just stared at James with an expression that was difficult to read. Not aggressive, not apologetic, just blank. James found his voice. "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" The man still didn't speak. He took a small step to the side, as if considering whether to move toward the stairs or retreat further into the corner. James's shock began to transform into fear. He backed up toward the stairs, never taking his eyes off the man. "I'm calling the police. You need to stay right there." But as James said this, the man moved quickly toward a small window near the ceiling at the back of the basement. It was one of those narrow windows that's partially below ground level. The man pushed it open and squeezed through with surprising speed. James ran up the stairs, shouting for Karen. He told her what happened, and she immediately called 911 while James grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check the window. The window had been pried open from the outside. The latch was broken, and there were tracks in the snow leading away from the house, heading toward a wooded area behind their property. The police arrived within minutes. They searched the basement and found more disturbing evidence. In the corner where the man had been standing, behind some boxes, there was a makeshift sleeping area. An old blanket, some empty food wrappers, plastic water bottle. The man had been living in their basement. The police estimated, based on the amount of trash and the condition of the sleeping area, that he'd been there for at least a week, possibly longer. James and Karen were horrified. They'd been living in the house, going about their daily routines, while a stranger was hiding in their basement, sleeping there, eating there, just a floor below where their children slept. The police searched the surrounding area but never found the man. They checked missing persons reports and criminal databases but couldn't identify him. He'd simply vanished into the winter night. An investigation revealed how he'd been entering and exiting. The basement window was old and the latch had been loose for months. James had been meaning to fix it but kept putting it off. Because it was winter, James and Karen never opened that window and had no reason to check it. The man had been careful. He'd only been in the basement when the family was unlikely to come down there. He'd hidden behind boxes and equipment during the day. And he'd survived on food he'd apparently brought with him or stolen from the house during the night when everyone was asleep. James and Karen couldn't sleep in that house anymore. They stayed with family for several weeks while they had new locks installed, security cameras set up, and all the basement windows secured with bars. Eventually they moved to a different town. Karen said the worst part was the knowledge that they'd been completely unaware, that their sense of safety had been an illusion. Their home, the place where they should have felt most secure, had been invaded, and they hadn't known. James still thinks about the man sometimes, who he was and why he chose their basement, what he might have done if he'd been discovered under different circumstances. Those questions don't have answers. But the experience changed how James and Karen think about safety, about awareness, about the places we call home. We trust familiar spaces because our brains are wired to recognize patterns and identify what's normal. Our homes represent security and comfort, and we rarely question that feeling. But when something violates that familiar space, when the predictable becomes unpredictable, it creates a profound sense of disorientation. Winter makes this worse because we spend more time indoors, more dependent on our homes as shelters from the cold. James and Karen's experience reminds us that vigilance matters everywhere, even in the places we know best. If you've experienced something similar, if you have a story you'd like to share, you can send it to the email address in the description below. I read every submission, and your story might be featured in a future video. If you found these stories compelling, please consider subscribing. There are more accounts to explore, more experiences to understand, and more truths waiting to be told. Stay aware, stay safe. And remember that even in the coldest nights, there are always lessons to be learned about ourselves and the world around us. Thank you for listening. Until next time.